Hey folks, it's Mary, aka MercyTriumphs, and this is my channel, Slow Crochet. This is episode 038, and I am here with a bit of an origin story and an explanation as to how I hold my yarn and why I yarn over from front to back instead of back to front. This is how I crochet. This is about as slow as I go. And I learned in a very particular way, and I thought, we all have different stories of how we picked up crochet. So I thought I would share mine today. I remember crochet from a very early age. My great-grandmother crocheted, and she would sit in her chair, and she had her thread and her tiny little steel hooks. And I remember her sitting there working, and she used to make pot holders. She would use size 10 steel hooks, and she would use thread and make a fan or a shell pattern, and then she would make 2 squares of those, double them up, and then stitch them together as pot holders for the family. She lived with us for a time when I was a child, but she passed when I was 8 years old, and I didn't learn to crochet from her, but she remains the matriarch of the family where yarn and needlecraft kind of began for me. I did learn to sew from my mother, I believe around age 6, but it wasn't until I was about 13 that my aunt and my 2 cousins were visiting, and we decided that it was time for the 3 great-granddaughters to learn to crochet. Now, why didn't I learn from my grandmother? Well, my grandmother herself was left-handed, and my great-grandmother, who was right-handed, declared she could never teach her daughter. So my grandmother instead turned to knitting. Although I don't have any memories of her knitting, just lots of memories of her wonderful cooking, and lots of her recipes are part of our life even today. So when I was 13 years old, my aunt presented me with exactly how she learned. She had crochet thread, and she had Great Granny's steel hooks. So Great Granny would always use a size 10, itty bitty tiny. And my little 13-year-old self learned on this. When my aunt was teaching, she was just happy for us to get the motions right. She remembered that Great Granny would loop the crochet thread around her finger and somehow hold it. But I didn't know which way she wrapped it around, whether clockwise or counterclockwise, and I didn't really understand tension at the time, as you don't really the first time you're learning. So whatever I was doing, though, seemed to work, and that was good enough for my aunt. She didn't really specify anything particular about yarning over from front to back or back to front, but the fact that I could get any kind of stitches out at all was enough for her. So that is how I developed my habits, because I wasn't really taught one particular way. I didn't have very strict teaching. It was just enough that I could do anything at all with any kind of crochet hook. At the time, I was very much into my American Girl doll, and I was also learning to sew. And so as I was learning to crochet and learning to sew, I would make things for that 18-inch doll. So my very first piece of crochet ever, I still kept in association with that doll. This is it right here. This is the type of shell pattern that my great-grandmother would do. Hers were obviously a lot tighter and smaller, but she would always work into the back bumps of her chains, and I keep this piece as a reminder of what it looks like to begin. First of all, that I was asked to begin with something so minuscule and small, but also to realize how things can change over time. My tension was all over the place. This curve is actually quite natural, just in the way that I was trying to get it out there. But when I was finished making it, I thought this would be a perfect little collar for a doll or a doll dress. So I kept it with my American Girl gear, and that's why it has stayed with me all of these years. As an adult, I picked up crochet again more intentionally when I was in college, and I made a friend who crocheted with worsted weight yarn of all things. Once I realized that, I went to the store and I got a size J 6mm hook. And it had to be boy because that was Great Granny's brand. You can see from my hook here, this is the one that I've had since college, how worn out it is, how the color has worn off right where I've held it. I wasn't given specific instruction either on how to hold the hook, so I always felt like, especially with the tiny steel hooks, I felt challenged because the thin thread would always slip off. So I found that if I put a finger right here to hold the loop there, that I could have a bit more control over what I was doing. How I hold my yarn now, I loop it around my finger in a clockwise manner, and then with the rest of my fingers, I wrap it around and kind of hold it here and direct the yarn with this finger. Sometimes I'm able to use my whole hand. I give my whole wrist a twist as I'm looping over. It wasn't until I started watching YouTube tutorials that I noticed something about how I yarn over. I had never questioned that there was a difference between yarning over from front to back or back to front. I didn't know any other way. I didn't know that there was a proper way or a correct way, and in my opinion, I guess there's really not. If you're happy and satisfied with the outcome, then that's that. But it wasn't until I started noticing some tutorials or some stitches looked a little different when I did it than when others did it that I thought, what is really going on here? And when I crochet, I just naturally bring my whole hand over to do a yarn over from front to back instead of the more traditional back to front. So for me, the little quirks in my crocheting, the reason that my crochet looks different than anyone else is because I learned at a time that was before the internet was really a thing. And I learned not just from my great-grandmother, but I learned from my aunt, her interpretation of my great-grandmother's crochet as well. I have this memory of my aunt not being so harsh on me or looking for it to be perfect, but allowing my hands to do it felt natural to them, and I was able to learn and enjoy and grow in the craft in a way that made me feel good. It does mean that I kind of go a little bit slower than others, especially with something like these slip stitches, but I don't really mind that. When I crochet, I get to connect to multiple generations of women in my family, those that are not even here with me anymore. And I know that whatever I do crochet, my hope is, will go on to be part of the heritage and the history of generations to come. So that is how I hold my yarn. That is how I hold my hook. That is my crochet origin story, and I would love to hear yours. Let me know in the comments below. How did you learn to crochet? Have you ever used steel hooks before? Have you always used yarn? Who are the people in your life that influenced how you crochet? And do you have any crochet quirks yourself? To all my subscribers, everyone that's been part of this YouTube adventure, I sure am thankful for you. I love that you're part of my life, and it's an honor being part of yours. And if I'm not your cup of tea, thank you so much for listening this long. I do appreciate you, and I hope I'll see you again soon. Bye.